You know, you can imagine standing in the middle of a desert and having a fishing rod, and there's a river about a mile downstream where we're sort of standing there shouting to the fish and saying, "Come on, fish," and we expect the fish to jump out of the river, flap along the sand a little bit and jump onto our rod so that we can wheel it in and say, "We've got one." And it's a really dumb illustration, but actually the reality is for so often many churches, we do respond like that.
We are going to be talking about this book, Parallel Faith, Walking Alongside Others on Their Journey to Christ. David Boden is with us. First of all, he's the operation director of Grace Foundation. I've seen some of the interviews he's done, and that is a Christian organization that actually goes into the schools there in the UK, doing something very much to what I've been doing over the years here in the United States. And so that I think we'll get into a little bit of detail. Also then created what was called Kleer Series, which is kind of a media ministry to help start some of these spiritual conversations with young people. And so again, Dave Boden is an individual that lives, works, and writes in West Midlands, England, and joins us now by phone. So Dave, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kirby. I'm really excited to be joining you all the way from a very sunny UK today.
Well, I'm glad it's sunny there. It looks like it might be sunny here as well. And again, I appreciate you being up at night. Oftentimes when I'm over there in the UK or oftentimes I go to Hungary and places like that, when I'm on this program, it's late at night. But nevertheless, this is a great deal. And let me just mention for our listeners, you might have seen that in the past I've posted one of these booklets that we make available for our donors on the next generation, talking about some of the challenges reaching the next generation. And then our most recent one dealing with this whole issue of spirituality, in which we find so many individuals will say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. And I think you're going to find these two booklets that we've made available to you and would be glad to give to you again. They parallel very much your book. So Dave, first of all, let's, if we can, kind of explain what you want to do, because really, in a sense, what we're talking about here is to follow Christ. And at the same time, as we walk along individuals, either individuals that we are discipling or individuals that we are trying to share the gospel with, we really need to be mindful of where they are in their mindset. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think traditionally, Jesus told us to go and make disciples. And if you actually talk to the average Christian like me, a few years ago, I might have said, I know that commandment, but I don't actually know what to do about it. And partly what I think the journey that I've been on, and I know, you yourself, sounds like from a lot of the things you've been involved in, is starting to break down the barriers and outside the box of what we say discipleship actually is and where it takes place. Because traditionally people think, well, discipleship is for a church meeting at a set time in a set place, and it's hosted by our discipleship pastor, which is fantastic and really brilliant. But actually, Jesus told us all to go and make disciples. So what happens if I'm not that discipleship pastor? What happens if I'm not available on a Tuesday night between 7:30 and 9:30? Do I get excluded from the Making the Disciples agenda? So really, I suppose the journey I've been on is to recognize that everybody that we meet is, first of all, completely loved by God, and everybody is either on a journey towards God or away from him. And what if we actually were to say that both discipleship and evangelism were on the same spectrum? They weren't separate departments in a church. They were just a journey. And some people start their journey quite far away from God, and we can help point them towards Jesus from their starting point and not ours. And some people are a little bit closer to God, and we can help them, grow closer to God and even themselves go out and help others find Jesus as well. So it's really about saying we're all on a journey. You are, I am. Let's help other people take one more step towards Jesus from their starting point.
I just mentioned that you have 4 pages of endorsements to your book. And I remember one of the individuals said, I just love how David Boden actually is able to weave together evangelism and discipleship, because quite frankly, sometimes in our churches and in our minds and in our brains, we keep those two separate. And sometimes as people are reading through your book, as I have, you're going, okay, what topic are we on here? Because you kind of move easily between one and the other. And in some respects, it seems like you're trying to actually break down the barrier between the two.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember somebody once used the phrase, disciplism is probably a better way of saying it, because I do think we have separated the two, and we've created these two like different departments, and we create two very different acts. And what happens is, when we think of evangelism, probably traditionally we sort of see ourselves as those who have to stand on a platform in front of crowds of people and declaring God's word in a very eloquent way to the masses. And then when we think of discipleship, we think maybe of being in a teaching setting, in a church meeting, or maybe one-on-one with your Bible out. And both of those are stereotypes which are true, and they're not wrong. We're not saying it's it has to be this and not that. But I think what we're saying is that actually, when we think about discipleship, it's way bigger than, and evangelism, way bigger than both those things. It stretches way beyond the stereotype. And how we share and talk about Jesus is, first of all, about being a disciple. If we want to make disciples, we have to be one, first of all. And secondly, it's about showing God wherever we go, but also telling others about him as well. And when we do that, it starts to move the dial in people's lives of the way they see God, the way they see Jesus, the way they talk about spirituality, and actually can help disciple them and move them, help take a step towards Jesus. So those booklets which you talked about at the start of the hour, they're so key, because they're all about recognizing that we live in a world where people probably wouldn't necessarily say they believe in God or they want to go to church in the same way many years ago they would have. But so many people out there, especially young people I work with, they'd say, yeah, I'm spiritually curious. So how do you help take somebody who's spiritually curious and say, well, actually, you're talking generally about spirituality, but
Yes.
what I believe, what I see is Jesus himself.
One of the things you point out in some of your interviews is certainly the idea that we want them to ask certain questions and are asking those questions. Now, the book's been out for quite some time. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but one of the reasons we have a link there is so that if this is something of interest, and I think it will be as we go through this, you can order it there. We also have a link to his Substack so that you can read some of the commentary he is involved with, and certainly some great ways in which this can challenge your Christian faith. But David, for just a minute, I thought we'd go to Devar Island in Scotland. After you told the story, I looked up on Wikipedia. Next time I'm in Scotland, if I can get over there, I'm interested, because anyway, there are all these caves in this place in Scotland, and you can get over to the island if you walk by foot on low tide. But there is a painting there that you went to look for. And I love the illustration because, first of all, it's always one of those things that you like to learn about in another country. But it, in some respects, is the way you start your book, because it illustrates how sometimes we see Jesus, but we don't see Jesus. Can you explain?
Yeah, so if we go back to 1887, and there's a Scottish man named Archibald MacKinnon, and he goes to sleep one night and has a vivid dream in which God appears to him and says that he needs to, the next day, go and paint this image of Jesus in one of the caves on this island called Devar. So the next day he gets up, and it's only accessible by low tide. He goes across to this cave, and he paints this image of Jesus over several days. And eventually this beautiful image of Christ is finished, and the local people discover it. And as you've read in the book, it's quite a funny story, because they discover it and people flock from all over Scotland because they genuinely believe that God has made this miraculously appear. And when they find out that it's just a mere mortal that painted this image of Christ, they kick him out of town. And it's not until he's an old man that the painting needs touched up, and people say, all's forgiven, Archibald, come back. Can you come and sort the painting out again? And when I first heard this story, I was like, I've got to go see this image of Christ. So whilst I was on holiday there, I downloaded a guide to be able to find this painting. So we went across at low tide, and it's actually in the 8th cave around this island. So we had to go past the church and past a signpost, and I passed this rock, and I followed this guide on my phone to get me there, and then entered the 8th cave. And my 4 children, ran in the cave excited to see Jesus, but they couldn't find him anywhere. And I'm searching around this cave, and I'm left, right, and center. My eyes are darting around, and I just cannot find Jesus anywhere. And my family give up, and they're sort of becoming like the baying mob with Archibald McKinley in 1887, where they just want to run me out of town, you know, and it's just not working very well for me. So I walk out the cave, and on the 10th attempt, one more time, I turn around, and suddenly there he is. There's this shaft of light that hits the cave in a certain way, and I see Jesus. And I see this beautiful image of Jesus, and I had this quite a sense of the presence of God in a holy moment where I was like, wow, I was looking for Jesus and I found him. And then I realized when I left that place that actually there's many people who are like that, is that they are told you can go and find Jesus in a certain place in a date or time, and they search for him and they don't find him, or they're desperately seeking to find God for so long that they actually give up. Or many people have a glimpse of what they think was Jesus, only to be disappointed by that false impression. And others, they think they've been told they were looking for him so long, they're just so disappointed and they never want to go back. And I realized that the only reason I found Jesus that day in that cave in Scotland was because I had a guide with me. And I had this little revelation from God, and I thought, what if we as Christians were called to be that guide? What if we're the people that can say, you know what, we can point you to Jesus? And isn't that what evangelism is? You know, when we talk about evangelism, it's helping people discover Jesus for themselves. And after that day, and you really should go, because it's quite a beautiful little cave, and it's a wonderful just walk, you know, an experience. But I just know there's so many people in my life who I've come alongside who said, well, I tried to find Jesus and never did. And I think that the gospel, that call to make disciples, is basically about us saying, we're willing to come alongside people and to be a guide and to say, I'll help you. And again, I will start where you are. And this is where evangelism and discipleship get mixed up, because what we're doing is help people take a step towards Jesus. So there's some people who've never heard of him, don't know anything about him. Most of the young people that I work with, they don't even know Jesus is real. So, you know, one of the things that we have to deal with in the schools work that I do is we have to spend a lot of time saying, do you realize that Jesus was actually a real person born over 2,000 years ago? And so many people don't even know he's real, but yet we as Christians are sometimes jumping the gun and saying, well, you need to give your life to Jesus. You need to ask Jesus into your heart. And these people out there, they don't even know that he was a real person. So I think part of the heart of that cave story was about helping people discover Jesus.
I might just mention, in your book, you have it broken down into parallel with purpose. That's the first 8 chapters, and then parallel with people. But it gets back to even the booklet that we just did recently, which parallels so well, pun intended, because we find that, I'll use the United States, but you can find the same percentages there in the UK. But in the United States, Pew Research concludes that at least 22% of all Americans fit into the category of spiritual, not religious. And that's where they have some kind of personal and subjective connection. They believe there may be something beyond them, but they may call it God or some life force, but they tend to avoid religious institutions and groups because they don't really want to be labeled as religious, and yet they have those same needs. And Dave, as I go through your book, there are times when you're identifying particular needs that you've found in the students that you've worked with through Grace Foundation, but they certainly are looking for the answers, and adults are looking for answers, but they're not convinced they're going to find any of those answers by walking in the door of a church. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. And you know, again, it's not to decry church in any way, shape, or form. I'm part of an active, vibrant local church, and I love the church and believe it's God's plan for the community of God. But I also understand that sometimes within the walls of the church, it can be a little bit like a fishbowl, can't it? Like where we understand, we set things up so that we're happy, we're very comfortable. We use a language, we use songs that we like, that appeal to us, and yet Jesus told us to go. So often the illustration I would use is, you know, Jesus said, I want to make you fishers of men, but there was an American broadcaster who said that we're called to be fishers of men, yet we've become keepers of the aquarium. and that's just challenging, isn't it? Because it's like, wow, you know, and I used to keep an aquarium, and I tell you what, my fish were very happy. They had the lights sorted, they had the coral sorted, the environment was perfect for them. Yet whatever was going on inside my aquarium made no difference whatsoever to what was beyond it. It could be wet as the ocean inside and dry as a bone on the outside. And often I think that's where we are with churches, is that we're just having a great time ourselves. And it's a little bit like sometimes, you can imagine standing in the middle of a desert and having a fishing rod, and there's a river about a mile downstream where we're sort of standing there shouting to the fish and saying, "Come on, fish." And we expect the fish to jump out of the river, flap along the sand a little bit and jump onto our rod so that we can wheel it in and say, "We've got one." And it's a really dumb illustration, but actually the reality is, for so often, many churches, we do respond like that. We expect people to come to us when Jesus told us to go.
Yes.
And I think part of the heart of walking parallel with people is you go to where people are. What Jesus did was he left the comfort zone of heaven and he came to earth. And I love the Message translation says that the word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. The traditional version says that God, the word was God, the word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. And I think that's what Jesus is saying, is to go and be where people are, not so we can become the same as them, but so that we can show them who Jesus is. Because at the end of the day, we're the only church they may visit, you and me. We might be the only Bible they ever read. So how do we live our lives as ambassadors of Jesus every day to make a difference where people are and show people that following Jesus is way more exciting than just attending boring religious meetings, which is their impression of what it's like?
One of the illustrations I use, and this is probably more an American movie that didn't do as well over in the UK, is Field of Dreams, because there's a phrase in there, "If you build it, they will come." And I say that is the myth of a lot of churches. If we build enough churches, they will come, but it's like your illustration of the fish having to go along on the sand and find their way to your particular church. So when we come back, you have some great suggestions about preparing and talking and translating. And so we're going to get into that in a little more detail. First half of the book really deals with parallel with purpose. We could camp out there, but I did want to get to the section on parallel with people, because, Dave, you talk about the fact that every preparation has a pattern, every culture has a context, every conversation is a catalyst. Every believer can be a beholder. Every creative person can be a change maker. Every teacher is a trainer. Every community can care like Christ. And so one of the things you talk about is this idea of preparation. And, of course, we so often quote from 1 Peter 3:15 that we should always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that anyone asks you, and that you should give a reason for the hope that you have, and to do that with gentleness and respect. And it does seem to me that, of course, is the idea of being ready, which, of course, would imply that we should know at least a little bit about how to present the gospel. One of the things we do here on Point of View is we not only want people to know how to articulate a biblical worldview, but also to know how to defend a biblical worldview, because that's going to be really important. And then you go on to talk about the verse I quoted before in terms of Colossians 4:6, of having your grace, your conversation full of grace and seasoned with salt. And it does seem to me right now what we need to do, as you have said, is to be able to listen to individuals, not necessarily superimpose our worldview on them, but find out what their questions, their needs, their doubts, their fears might be. Because if we're going to walk alongside with them, that's exactly what they would want us to do for them, because it's exactly what we would want to do if we were in that position that they are in.
Yeah, and it's also exactly the way that Jesus was as well, right? He actually, when he spoke with people, he took time to get to know everybody. And interestingly enough, he even adapted some of the message depending on who he was talking to. And there's so many examples of that in Scripture, isn't there? But that 1 Peter 3:15, it is such a seminal verse, isn't it? That always be ready. And that implies to me that some of the conversations that we're going to have in life, they may not happen at convenient moments for us. So I am a parent I've got 2 adult children now and 2 teenagers. And the one thing you know about raising teenagers is they always want to have a conversation when you don't want to. It's always 11 o'clock at night, yes. You're in bed, and suddenly they come alive, and we need to be willing as parents to be interruptible from our day-to-day life, or often the end of our day, to engage with that teenager. And I think it's the same with people. We've got people all around us. We're walking alongside people. We don't have to go to the far side of the world to go on mission. We don't have to get on a plane. We have people in our sphere of influence every day. But often, this scripture says we need to be ready. So that implies that something could happen at any point, any time. Am I willing to be interruptible in order to be able to have that frustratingly inconvenient conversation? And it often happens to me, when I'm in the middle of doing something else, somebody will ask a question. And I always pray, like, God, give me ears to hear what people are saying, because I don't want to miss the moment. Like, in the middle of my busyness and my day, there could be an opportunity for a conversation here. And part of the parallel faith thing really is about saying, actually, in so many ways, we have forgotten the spaces where we can have conversations. Because you mentioned earlier that, we live in that world where there's a lot of polarization, right? There's a lot of people talking at each other and not many people talking with each other. And so often we as Christians, we go with our prepackaged sort of gospel presentation that we're desperate to get almost infringe on somebody. And yet what Jesus did, and what I believe we need to do, is often just start with where the person is. And before we tell them something, about what we think, let's just ask them a question. And so often I ask people all the time. I've done it 4 times this week. I'll say, what is your understanding of faith? What's your understanding of Christianity so far? And they just tell me. It's unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
It's not more complex than that. It's like, what do you understand about it? And they'll say, well, I grew up my grandma, she knew this, or I had some situation as a child where I used to believe. And of course, that then gives you, when you talk about translating the gospel, when we talk about the language we need to use, once you know what people already know, you can build from there. And so often we just assume that everybody knows what we know.
Right.
And actually in education, we call it the curse of knowledge. It's a really interesting phrase. It says, so when you're trying to teach a young person something new, you can start so high and far on that you're cursed with knowledge. So you know all that, and you assume the person you're trying to teach knows it all already. So one of the things that I've learned when having conversations with people about faith and discipleship and being an evangelist for me is I've learned that I just don't assume anything anymore. and I just ask them, if you don't know, I'll say, what do you know about this already? And also, some of the language that we use as Christians can be so religious from our religious bubble that people do not understand what we're talking about. And it's a bit like back in COVID, when everybody suddenly moved to these video calls. Mm-hmm. And there was always that one guy on the meetings that you'd have who was talking at you, but they were on mute, and we had that. Everybody else in the room was going, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
But that person was
we can't hear
very
you.
passionate.
Yeah.
They're so passionate, right? And they were talking at us, but nobody was listening.
Yes.
And I think often, like the church is like that. We're talking at the world, but we're on mute. And the world is not polite enough to say, oh, guys, by the way, church, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? They just get on with the other thing, right? And I think, that becomes because we're not listening to what's going on around us. And I'm not saying that we dilute the message. I'm not saying we change the gospel. The gospel hasn't changed in 2,000 years. It's good news for everybody. But I do think sometimes when we start with where people are, it helps us to lead them to where we know God wants them to be.
I just mentioned, too, a lot of that is in your chapter on translating, but also the one on talking. You've already said some critical things, and I wanted to give you a chance to say a few more because you've talked about 3 challenges. One is that we're too tech-driven. That is, we're becoming more technologically driven because of our phones, too agenda-driven, and too results-driven. And if you want to have open conversation, you need to be aware of those 3 challenges, don't you?
Absolutely. And, the whole, obviously, tech-driven is the thing where we spend so much time on our phones now that we've lost those downtimes, we're young people and even adults. I think we've forgotten how to be bored because we're so checking our phone 150 times a day and often even more that we're filling all those moments where conversation used to fill those moments of the in-betweens, whether you're at a bus stop or you're waiting for something to happen, and the in-between moments, I think tech-driven is a challenge for us. Agenda-driven is hard for us as Christians, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we are passionate and we really want to say our thing. And I think sometimes one of the things that I've learned is that we are not responsible for the outcome of conversations with people, but we are responsible for our obedience. And I've learned to trust that God is bigger than me and bigger than me, it all being on me to make sure that I say everything that ever exists about Christianity to that person in one go, or they're going to miss the moment forever, which can often be the pressure. So I've learned to let go of my agenda in conversations and try and get them God's. And then, that whole thing about being too results orientated is, I think it's linked in there, is that often we think that we have to be the one that seals the deal. But you'll know the research yourself, the average person, it takes at least 3 people to hear the gospel before they respond to it. So I've just learned, I might just be one of those 3 people, and actually in life, I've learned to become a signpost. So even one of the things, if I do have an agenda, what I try to do in discipleship conversations and evangelism conversations is always give people a next step. So I would remember I was talking to a lady in Cornwall a while ago, and she came to me because my daughter knew, and she said, "I heard you're the guy that talks about God." And I was like, "Okay, I'll take it. That's fine."
Okay.
And she wanted to tell me her story, so she told me her story, and at the end of it, I looked at her, and she had a tattoo on her arm, and the tattoo said the word hope.
Wow.
And I said to her, "Why have you got that tattoo?" I said, "What does that word hope mean to you?" And she said, "Yes, I don't know why I've got this tattoo." And I said, "Well, what's your source of hope?" And she said, "I've never found it before.
Never found it.
But
Yeah.
I've never found it, but I've got this tattoo to remind me that when I do find my source of hope," she said these words, she said, "I'm going to tell everyone."
Wow.
What a powerful
Great
statement
line.
from a non-Christian. So I then said, "Well, can I tell you about where I found my hope?"
And Dave, you were talking about, you're the guy that talks about Jesus. And I thought for just a minute I might share a story, because not only do I interview people, but oftentimes because I write books and things, I'm interviewed. And the other day I was on a podcast with an individual who is also a pastor, and he was saying that the individuals that he's getting to know in his community, because he's trying to get outside of, if you will, the religious bubble, all appreciate him and love him and his wife, and they're really interacting with him. But he says, I also recognize that everybody kind of comes to me with some fear and trepidation. He says, I'm kind of like the insurance guy. You just know sooner or later he's going to talk about insurance. I'm the pastor. They know I was a pastor. So sooner or later he's going to talk about that Jesus stuff. And so in some respects, whether we have an agenda or not, people place an agenda on us. But in your case, and I think even in his case and my case, that provides an opportunity, because sooner or later they know that you can talk about those issues. And I thought it related very much to your chapter on hosting, because my wife and I walk at least twice a day, and we get to know all sorts of people in our community. As a matter of fact, I was talking about, I went to the HOA meeting the other day, the Homeowners Association, and everybody knows us because we're out walking around. We're like the mascots of the neighborhood. But interesting enough, the last time we walked by this Muslim couple that we've gotten to know for some time, she out of the blue says, I need to have you over for tea. And I thought, well, she beat us to the punch, because that's something we should do. But it illustrates again that if we are real, authentic, willing to interact with individuals and listen, sometimes that will open a door, won't it?
Absolutely. It's, hospitality in the way that we use our homes and really open up our lives is such a key thing for evangelism and discipleship. I mean, last night we had 5 Gen Zs, young people in our home, and we just literally, the agenda was come for food and games. Now, that was the agenda. By the end of it, we're having conversations about how me and my wife got together, and they're asking us questions about our relationship. And then at the end of it, one of them was going off for something, in a few weeks' time. So he says, well, can we just pray for you before you go? So it was not a church meeting, but you would not have got away with that evening without seeing God somehow at the center of it, even though it was just food and games. And I think, Kirby, that is partly what we're called to do, isn't it, as Christians, is just to invite people. And even Christians sometimes don't invite other Christians to their home, let alone inviting people that don't yet know Jesus. And I think the dinner table is one of the greatest places for discipleship, because round the table, people open up and they just start talking.
One of the things that you do talk about in your book is teaching, and again, 2 Timothy 2:2, things you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. And that's, of course, discipleship. I'm going to disciple individuals, then they will go and disciple others. But in some of the interviews I've heard you do, you make a real distinction between teaching and learning. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a platform to talk about the difference between those two.
Yeah, this is such a key point. So our churches are full of teaching, right? So we have sermons, we have small groups, we have podcasts, we have Bible studies, and there's so much teaching. Yet one of the hallmarks of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is basically, if you hold to my words, and put them into practice, then you are my disciples. So what Jesus is looking for is not just knowing his teaching, but doing something about it. And that's where the learning side of it comes in. So I think it'd be really great for churches to ask themselves, we're teaching all this, but what are people actually learning? Well, what's the difference? Well, learning is basically putting something into practice. So I don't know what it's like in the States, but in England, we have two sides of the learning to drive. So there's the study guide where you have to learn about the road signs and the roads, and you do what's called a theory test online. So you learn the theory of it, and then there's getting in the car. So often I think our teaching in churches is like we teach them how to tick a box, and we teach people how to sort of know what a road sign is, but how often are we actually taking that learning and putting it into practice? And building a discipleship culture in a church, I think, is saying, actually, we want our teaching to translate into learning. So just because the teacher knows what's going on and is engaged, it doesn't mean in the classroom that the students necessarily are. So I think biblical learning and the type of learning that Jesus talks about is learning that is put into practice, and also learning that is passed on to others. So I think, if next Sunday morning you and I are in church and the pastor stands up and says, just to let you know that tomorrow night you're going to be standing up and delivering this sermon in a church down the road. Well, the way that we would pay attention to that meeting and that sermon would be completely different, because we would know that the next day we had to do something about it. We had to deliver it and pass it on to somebody else. Well, what if we saw all teaching in church like that? What if we saw that actually we're not just to be passive consumers of the Bible, we are to be those that hear it and become doers of the word. And Jesus was so big on this. And I think teaching versus learning is such a simple thing, isn't it, Kirby? It's such a simple phrase. You almost feel silly talking about it. It almost feels quite Sesame Street. But actually, I do think that discipleship, the goal of discipleship is not to create better church attendees. The goal of discipleship is to create people that become more like Jesus.
Yes.
So Christ-likeness is the goal of discipleship. So therefore, there has to be a personal responsibility and accountability for me to take the teaching that I'm learning and do something about it.
Yes.
How is it changing me and shaping me? And how is the Word of God? People talk about reading the Bible, and then other people say, well, we don't read the Bible reads us. So how is the Bible reading us and actually saying, there's this area of your life that God's prodding on and says you need to change? And it's these real world instructions that I think are at the heart of discipleship. And the way that we listen, when I once went skiing, for the first time, and I had a ski instructor, and I tell you what, I hung on every word that ski instructor said, because I knew that 20 minutes later, I was going to be out on those slopes.
Yeah.
I'm going to be skiing.
That's for
and
sure.
By the way,
we're trying
I'm
to.
terrible at
And
it.
I might just mention that your blog actually has a section, How Not to Ski. That came out in March. And so we're almost out of time. Let me just mention, because I don't want us to leave without talking about the fact that you do have a wonderful opportunity for people to read some of the things you've written. DaveBoden.subspec.com. You don't have to worry about that because you've got sections on how not to share your faith. The one question that unlocks purpose for teenagers. Dear Billie Eilish. Even, I love this one, met my younger self for coffee today. So there are all sorts of things that you are writing. So if people said, well, I'd like to read you first, I'd like to get a copy of the book, we've got all that information there. And again, we've got that link so that people can follow you, see what you've written. We, of course, have a link to X and to Facebook and, of course, information about the book. So I should probably say it's about time for you to get to bed, but it was just delightful to have you on the program. And thank you for writing the book. And thank you for giving us an entire hour here on Point of View.
Well, thanks so much, Kirby. I really appreciate what you guys are doing in helping shape a discipleship culture through the radio waves as well. So thank you for all you're doing.
Well, hope you appreciated the conversation we had here today. And don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.